Welcome back to the deep dive. You know the drill. We take the stack of source material you've provided and we plunge deep into the analysis, cutting through the noise to find those critical nuggets of insight.
And this time, you've really given us something to chew on.
Yeah, it's substantial. A brand new study that systematically dissects why, in a world that's supposedly, committed to peace, nations continue to resort to armed force.
And this is an intensive piece of research. It moves far beyond just, the simple generic claim that war is irrational or that all states are seeking security.
Right.
The mission for us and for you is to understand the specific structural failures, the psychological compulsions, and the historical baggage, the real levers that move leaders to initiate conflict.
We're trading sweeping generalizations for forensic specificity.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack this immediately. The timing of this work is, well, it's not just relevant. It's frankly alarming.
Oh, absolutely.
The author explicitly states they began revisiting this project in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but they completed the final manuscript in late 2024.
Yeah, and that's amid a global environment that was seemingly spiraling even further into fragmentation.
So the current geopolitical context, it acts as this dramatic counterpoint to the study's own data.
It really does. The author points out this tension between, on one hand, strengthening global norms against territorial conquest, which were sort of reinforced by Russia's isolation,
Right.
versus, on the other hand, the chaos introduced by domestic political upheaval in the West.
And the source material really highlights the stark possibilities raised by that upheaval, particularly following Donald Trump's 2024 re-election.
It does. The author documents the rapid dismantling of the Western post-war security order, including, the abrupt withdrawal from long-standing alliances and, critically, the introduction of overtly aggressive foreign policy demands.
Some of those demands are pretty shocking.
Yeah, the ones cited: Greenland, Panama, the desire to annex Canada, praise for Russia, the demand for half of Ukraine's mineral wealth. I mean, the author uses these as evidence of a potential paradigm shift.
Paradigm shift to what, exactly?
It's described as a return to a 19th century robber baron foreign policy, a path toward a dangerous and potentially barbaric international system.
And we should be clear here. These assessments of, the destruction of the post-war order and those specific demands, that's the interpretation, the contextualizing frame used by the author of the source material.
Yes, absolutely. It's their frame.
But it certainly sets a gloomy stage. Yet despite this current pessimism, the study kicks off with a surprisingly hopeful claim about historical trends.
It does, which is fascinating. The core finding, and this really challenges modern cynicism, is that the overall frequency of war has declined over centuries.
So humanity is actually capable of learning.
That's the suggestion, that leaders and political systems do avail. They can learn from past mistakes.
Okay, so if learning is happening, where's the failure? Because clearly wars still happen, and often with brutal frequency.
And that brings us to the central paradox of the source material. The great powers, the very nations that claim to have learned the most, that established and supposedly uphold international law,
They're the ones who haven't learned.
they're the least likely to have absorbed this lesson. They were the first to understand that economic wealth no longer comes from conquest.
Right, through trade and innovation.
Exactly. But they are the last to realize that armed force no longer confers legitimate standing or prestige.
That's a massive insight.
Yeah.
They're basically operating on an outdated definition of what makes a nation great.
Yes.
And when you look at the raw data for armed force initiation since 1945, which state is the primary offender?
Well, the data is unambiguous. The United States has initiated armed force 13 times, making it the greatest offender by volume.
13 times.
Followed closely by the USSR and now Russia, with 9 initiations.
So, the argument is that the world's most powerful states are actively undermining the very system they created, driven by this almost psychological need for an outdated notion of prestige and dominance.
It's not just about security.
It's about status. Thumos, as we'll get into.
Exactly.
That is a perfect pivot point. Let's delve into Section 1, which handles the essential but often messy process of definition.
Okay. So to analyze the problem rigorously, the study had to tackle a major conceptual challenge. We need a clear, consistent definition of armed conflict.
Right.
And that means dissolving the common, but often deliberately misleading, distinction between a war and an intervention.
For most of us, I think there's an immediate intuitive difference. A war sounds, total mass mobilization, maybe it's declared.
Sure.
An intervention sounds clean, limited, brief, maybe a few airstrikes or a temporary deployment.
And the study argues that this distinction is, well, it's often politically convenient, but it's analytically arbitrary.
Arbitrary how?
The authors deliberately group interventions and wars together because, fundamentally, both involve the calculated use of armed force to achieve political goals.
Ah.
So whether you call it a police action, a limited strike, or a full-scale war, the act of using military violence to compel another state is the same phenomenon.
So the term intervention is really just a political category, a way to label and maybe sanitize one form of coercion to make it sound less severe or less consequential than a war.
Precisely. If a great power uses overwhelming force to change a regime or influence the policy of a smaller state, the actual violence, the duration, the goals of the initiator, they're often interchangeable with what we might call a small war.
So for an academic trying to get to the root of conflict, the label doesn't matter.
The label doesn't matter. The act of initiating armed force to compel a political outcome does.
This conceptual challenge leads directly into one of the most important critiques in the source material, questioning the traditional metrics we use to measure war. Specifically, the widely accepted correlates of war, or COW, threshold of 1,000 battle deaths.
Yeah.
Why is relying on that specific number becoming, obsolete?
The source identifies 4 fundamental flaws, and we really need to spend some time here because this affects everything that follows.
Okay, let's start with the first one, context.
First, the metric assumes that 1,000 battle deaths mean the same thing across time, space, and relative power levels. But they just don't.
Right.
I mean, consider a war in the 1950s between 2 small, poorly equipped armies in the developing world that results in 1,000 fatalities.
Okay.
Now, compare that to a conflict today between 2 great powers involving massive logistical support and precision targeting that also results in 1,000 battle deaths.
The significance is completely different.
Not even remotely equivalent. The sheer political significance, the resource commitment, the global implications, the metric just abstracts away all that critical context.
You're comparing a skirmish that might only affect a small region to a major test of wills between global powers. The measurement of violence has to account for the context of power.
Exactly. Then the second flaw addresses medical technology. The study draws heavily on the work of Tanisha Fazal here, and it emphasizes that major improvements in battlefield medicine, from rapid evac via helicopter to advanced trauma care, mean that severe injuries that were inevitably fatal 70 years ago are now survivable.
So if we're only looking at deaths, we're severely undercounting the intensity and the severity of modern conflict.
Yes. If a conflict today causes, say, 5,000 casualties but only 800 deaths, by the old COW standard, it's not a war.
But 70 years ago, those 5,000 casualties might have resulted in 2,500 deaths.
And it would have easily crossed the threshold. The metric becomes an artifact of medical history, not a measure of political violence.
Wow. Okay, that's a perfect summary of the problem. What's the third flaw?
Third, and this is perhaps the most morally and practically critical, the metric ignores civilian deaths.
Which in modern warfare can be huge.
In modern counterinsurgency, or urban warfare, civilian fatalities often far outnumber combat deaths. So by focusing strictly on battle deaths, the COW metric ignores the immense human cost and the political destabilization that defines so many 21st century conflicts.
It paints a totally incomplete, sanitized picture of the reality on the ground.
Totally. And finally, the fourth flaw is forward-looking. The metric risks becoming an anachronism entirely with the rise of modern conflict types like electronic warfare, sophisticated cyber operations, or precision strikes against infrastructure.
Things that can cause massive strategic damage with few casualties.
You can achieve massive strategic goals, like collapsing an entire national power grid or a financial system, with potentially very few or even 0 human casualties.
We are rapidly entering an era where you can be defeated without ever losing a single soldier in a kinetic battle.
And a definition that relies on battle deaths simply cannot capture that strategic reality.
The source uses a couple of really good anecdotes to anchor this critique.
It does. Take the Indian annexation of Goa in 1961. The entire operation resulted in only 52 deaths.
52. By the traditional threshold, that's insignificant. A rounding error.
But it was a massive political achievement for India, the forceful annexation of a colonial territory. It clearly constitutes the use of armed force to compel a political outcome.
So then you contrast that with something like the Falklands War in 1982.
Right. The Argentine junta initiated that action, viewing it as a short, low-casualty intervention, something like Goa. They were using armed force to achieve a political goal.
But they miscalculated.
They gravely miscalculated the British political and military response, and that led to high casualties. The point is, the defining element was the nature of the conflict, the political goals, and the miscalculation, not the eventual death toll, which was the result of that miscalculation.
This shift in perspective is crucial. I mean, if we only focus on the big bloody conflicts, we fail to analyze the initial acts of aggression and coercion that characterize the behavior of states, especially great powers. And if miscalculation about the nature of the conflict is key, as we saw with the Falklands, then we need a better framework than just death counts.
Which is why the study introduces 15 structural categories of conflict.
Okay, let's get into those.
Moving past generic metrics allows the study to achieve what it calls specificity. War isn't generic. We can't apply the same analytical lens to a colonial uprising as we do to a great power proxy war or a conflict between, say, rump states.
The causes, the motives, the likely outcomes are all fundamentally different.
Fundamentally different. So the study uses 15 distinct structural categories to reflect this.
That is such a critical point. If you want to solve a conflict, you need to know which of the 15 buckets it falls into. Let's start with one of the most tragic and enduring categories: divided nations.
The study identifies 4 classic cases: Germany, Korea, Vietnam, and China, Taiwan.
And what's the defining characteristic here?
That these were formerly highly integrated United Nations whose division was typically imposed or maintained by external great powers, primarily the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
But the outcomes in those cases were wildly different, which I guess tells us a lot about the importance of legitimacy.
Oh, absolutely.
So why did Germany reunify quickly and peacefully, while Vietnam unified through conquest?
Well, the German example is a case study in failed political legitimacy. East Germany, the DDR, was fundamentally a Soviet creation. It never managed to forge a legitimate national identity or gain widespread popular support.
It was propped up.
Heavily. It relied on the repression of the Stasi secret police. So when the Soviet Union, under Gorbachev, effectively signaled it would no longer violently oppose reforms,
The whole thing just collapsed.
it collapsed almost instantly. Reunification was swift. It required complex international diplomacy, of course, but no military conquest between the two halves.
A political implosion rather than a military solution. Vietnam, on the other hand, was a military takeover facilitated by internal political rot.
Totally. North Vietnam successfully mobilized deep national sentiment, having been the primary force resisting French colonialism.
They had the legitimacy.
They did. South Vietnam, on the other hand, established a series of corrupt and often culturally distinct governments that just failed to build a viable Southern identity or popular base. The U.S. propped up a military structure, but once American ground forces withdrew, the collapse of the political regime was inevitable.
So North Vietnam succeeded because they solved the political problem, not just the military one.
Precisely.
And then we have the two lingering volatile divisions, Korea and China-Taiwan. How'd they compare?
Well, they're volatile for different reasons. The Korean division, which arose initially from U.S. and Soviet zones of occupation, remains one of the world's most militarized zones, complicated exponentially by the North's nuclear arsenal.
And the North has survived through total repression, not legitimacy.
Right, through a cult of personality. China and Taiwan, or the ROC, is fundamentally different, and the study attributes Taiwan's continued survival to 3 crucial factors.
Okay, what are they?
Yes. First, Taiwan developed a robust, legitimate democracy and a distinct national identity, which is politically impossible for Beijing to just absorb peacefully.
Second is geography.
Geography matters immensely. Taiwan is an island roughly 220 kilometers from the mainland, making any amphibious invasion logistically complex and incredibly risky.
Not like a land invasion.
Not at all. And third, and this is critical, there is the credible deterrent of American protection.
So Taiwan has this trifecta: legitimacy, geography, and external military backing.
A trifecta that East Germany and South Vietnam both lacked.
That distinctions, superpower imposition versus internal factors, leads us to the second major category: partitioned countries.
Right. Partition countries are those arising from internal reasons, typically following the dissolution of a colonial empire or a historical state. The division is based on internal fractures, language, religion, ethnicity.
And there are 21 cases of this, so this is a highly frequent trigger for conflict.
Free.
The source notes the irony that Ireland is blessed compared to others in this category, despite the history of the Troubles. Why is its partition relatively less volatile today.
Well, the key is that no interstate war occurred between the partition units Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland.
So the violence was internal, not state on state.
Exactly. Devastating internal political violence, but the units themselves did not mobilize armies to cross borders. Plus, the Republic of Ireland established a strong, democratic, legitimate government capable of neutralizing the militant IRA's threat.
And the economic integration helped too.
Significantly, it cushioned the shock of political events like Brexit.
And this stands in stark contrast to the Indian subcontinent, India and Pakistan.
That is the textbook example of partition leading to enduring conflict. I mean, the initial division in 1947 was traumatic, leading to 4 subsequent interstate wars.
And the study notes that 3 of those 4 were initiated by Pakistan.
They were. And the conflict is perpetually poisoned by the ongoing Kashmir dispute, which the source describes as symbolic and deeply, deeply damaging.
You mentioned that the study attributes the sustenance of the Kashmir dispute in part to the internal politics of Pakistan.
That's right. While there is a legitimate element to the Pakistani nationalist claim, given Kashmir's Muslim majority, the source argues that the conflict is actively sustained, sometimes even manufactured, by the powerful Pakistani military establishment.
Why? To what end?
The conflict justifies the army's oversized internal role. It allows it to define the national ideology against the perceived threat of India, and it frequently justifies its periodic seizure of political power. It's an external conflict used for internal stability and influence.
Wow. And finally, the direct fallout of partition in the Middle East.
Yeah.
The Israel-Palestine conflict.
This is framed as a fundamental clash of 2 competing nationalisms stemming from the division of Mandate Palestine. Now, Israel rejects the framing of it as a colonial conflict, seeing itself as an indigenous, self-determining nation. But regardless of the framing, the persistent use of armed force by Israel to guarantee security has led to a dangerous paradox.
And the paradox is that Israel's military superiority, rather than repelling attacks, seems to actually provoke them.
Exactly. Israel has achieved total military success in virtually every engagement since 1948. Rationally, this should enforce deterrence.
But it doesn't.
No. The source argues that the repeated military defeats and the subsequent humiliation suffered by Arab neighbors and Palestinians create an almost inevitable impetus for future confrontation rooted in thumos, the quest for status, honor, and revenge.
So it fuels long-term radicalization.
It's a constant recruitment tool, meaning that military victory rarely translates into political peace.
That links perfectly to the third structural category, one driven almost entirely by the psychology of loss. Rump states.
A rump state is the diminished remnant of a once much larger, powerful, or culturally expansive state or empire.
So classic historical examples would be Germany, Austria, and Hungary after the Treaty of Versailles.
Yes, or more recently, Serbia and Russia following the breakup of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union.
The term itself is inherently negative, isn't it? It suggests what's just left over.
Yeah.
What is the psychological dimension that makes rump states uniquely prone to conflict?
It's an acute sense of historical injustice and diminished stature. A significant percentage of people in these states feel robbed of their rightful place in territory.
It's a psychological wound.
It is. And that wound makes them highly receptive to charismatic, often nationalist politicians who promise to restore greatness. This is a key, non-material driver of conflict.
And we saw this historically. The rise of Hitler was built on successfully repudiating the terms of the Versailles Treaty that had transformed the German Reich into a pariah rump state.
Yes. The restoration of status, the renunciation of what were seen as unjust losses, becomes the foundational step toward expansionism.
And the modern parallel is, well, it's undeniably Russia.
Undeniably. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia lost a quarter of its territory and 60% of its population. While technically a successor state, it functions psychologically as a rump state.
And that psychological framing dictates its foreign policy in the near abroad.
Precisely. Russia's aggressive actions, Georgia in 2008, Crimea in 2014, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, are viewed by the authors as a continuation of a project to restore Russia's great power status.
And to reassert influence over territories, it views as historically and culturally linked to itself.
Right. Putin's narrative, viewing Ukraine as part of Russia, only amplifies the sense of diminished status and historical entitlement, making the use of armed force an unavoidable step toward achieving that restoration.
The specificity is powerful, but you mentioned there are 15 categories. We've covered 3, which are heavily defined by identity and division. To appreciate the depth of the study, let's touch on how the others are distinguished. maybe. Proxy wars and quests for hegemony.
Good ones. They're crucial, especially for analyzing great power behavior. Proxy wars are armed conflicts where great powers avoid direct military engagement with each other.
Right. They sponsor or supply client states or militias to fight their battles for them.
It's a low-risk, high-impact way for states like Iran, the US, or Russia to project power and contest regional influence without triggering massive escalation.
It's basically outsourcing violence, which minimizes the financial and human costs for the initiator, and it avoids those ethical traps we'll discuss later.
Exactly. And then you have the quest for hegemony. This category applies almost exclusively to great powers.
So like the U.S. intervention in Panama in 1989 or the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan.
Perfect examples. The use of force is primarily aimed at securing spheres of influence, testing the limits of international acceptance, or just asserting dominance in a region. The goal isn't just territory, it's confirming the right to order the system.
Which often brings us back to the U.S., which frequently justifies its interventions under the guise of maintaining a rules-based order.
Even when the action itself is a destabilizing source of disorder.
So if a colonial war is about control of resources and people, and a partition war is about internal identity, a quest for hegemony is about demonstrating the right to use force.
Which brings us full circle to the paradox of great power status.
It's clear that structures matter deeply, but structures don't act. People do.
And that's the next critical piece. Moving from the structural conditions to the specific agency of individuals, we have to acknowledge that leaders' personalities and perceptions are often the decisive factor.
The tyranny of leaders.
That's the term the source uses.
We're not talking about structural determinism here. We're talking about the contingent role of certain individuals.
Precisely. The study introduces this idea of the conqueror syndrome, where the personalities of leaders matter profoundly.
So when we look at figures like Idi Amin, Muammar Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, or Vladimir Putin,
the authors make a startling claim. They suggest that nearly 10% of all interventions and wars in the entire dataset since 1945 might have been avoided had these specific individuals, with their unique appetites for risk and power, never come to power.
10%. That suggests that a political system's ability to tolerate or empower a single aggressive personality can be a tipping point toward war.
Independent of economics or security dilemmas, yes. And their decisions are filtered through their perception of their own agency, their freedom of action, and the constraints they face.
So an overly ambitious leader might exaggerate their freedom, leading to hubris and risky adventures.
While a leader facing severe domestic pressure might misread an external threat, leading to an unnecessary preemptive strike just to unite the country.
This brings us to the fundamental human motives that drive these leaders, beyond the specific goals of territory or influence. The study codes these into three timeless categories: appetite, fear, and thumos.
Appetite is the easiest to grasp, pure material gain. Resources, territory, wealth extraction.
But what's fascinating is the historical trajectory of appetite.
It has declined sharply as a dominant motive since the 18th century.
And this reflects that first wave of learning you mentioned earlier, right? The economic realization that wealth isn't a zero-sum game extracted through conquest.
Exactly. Political and economic elites largely learned that true sustainable wealth in the modern era comes far more reliably through trade, innovation, production, services.
Things that benefit from peace.
They require and benefit from peace and stability. So few modern wars are fought purely for material gain.
Iraq's 1990 invasion of Kuwait is an exception, though.
A notable exception, driven partly by desperation over massive debt and oil prices, but even that was heavily wrapped in status claims.
So the profit motive, which once defined colonial expansion, has largely been replaced by the other two. What replaced it?
Fear. Fear, encompassing genuine security concerns, perceived existential threats, or even fear driven purely by domestic political calculations.
And this is the dominant motive.
It is, accounting for 44% of cases. 38 interventions. However, and this is a big however, the study finds that this fear is frequently greatly exaggerated or altogether misplaced.
The history of the Cold War is just littered with examples of inflated fear leading to disaster.
Oh, absolutely. Think of the U.S. delusion that the Viet Cong were merely Moscow's agents, a small part of a global monolithic communist threat, rather than a powerful indigenous nationalist movement.
Or more recently, the widespread manufactured fear of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in 2003.
A perfect example. Leaders were motivated to act preemptively based on inflated threat assessments that were later proven baseless. Fear generates action, regardless of reality.
And then there's thumos, the concept I find the most intriguing and perhaps the most relevant to today's conflicts.
Thumos, it's an ancient Greek word. It means honor, spirit, a kind of passionate drive. The authors translate it in a geopolitical context as the persistent quest for status, honor, recognition, and revenge.
So it complicates a leader's rational choice calculation.
It totally does. If appetite is purely self-interest based on wealth, thumos is self-interest based on dignity and respect. It requires external recognition.
Yeah.
It's the non-material psychological driver that remains constant, even as the economic calculus of war has changed. Thumos provides the connective tissue between seemingly disparate conflicts.
So it links former colonial powers struggling to retain relevance, like Britain and France, during Suez in 1956.
To the partitioned countries using conflict to forge national solidarity, like the dynamic between Israel and its adversaries. And it fuels rump states like Russia trying to restore their lost greatness.
That makes it arguably the most dangerous motive today, because it bypasses rational economic cost-benefit analysis.
A leader driven by thumos is willing to pay a much, much higher price for the sake of status.
And when you mix these motivations, especially misplaced fear and constant thumos, with the human element,
Yeah.
you get the engine of conflict failure, miscalculation.
And this data point should stop every policymaker in their tracks. Out of the 87 cases of armed force initiation analyzed, 65 involved significant miscalculation by the initiators.
65. That is a failure rate approaching 75%.
3/4 of the time. The vast majority of people who start a war fundamentally get it wrong.
So nearly 3/4 of the time, the country that fires the first shot either fundamentally misunderstands the risks, the adversary's resolve, or the eventual political outcome. What are the most common ways they miscalculate?
They generally fall into 3 types. The first, and most common for great powers, is mistaking military success for political success. They win the battle decisively.
But they can't translate that military advantage into a stable, favorable political outcome.
Exactly.
We've seen this repeatedly. The US and UK quickly defeated Saddam Hussein's army in 2003, but they failed to consolidate power, prevent sectarian fragmentation, or establish a legitimate successor regime.
The military objective was met. The political one failed catastrophically. The same happened at Suez in 1956 for Britain and France.
Okay, what's the second type of miscalculation?
Faulty threat assessment. This is where leaders either drastically inflate a minor threat, like the U.S. exaggerating the capabilities and intentions of regimes in Nicaragua or Grenada, or they minimize a severe threat.
Like Kuwait minimizing Saddam's threat right before the 1990 invasion.
Right. They felt free to deny his territorial and debt demands. Both errors lead to conflict.
And the third type is linked to raw psychological factors, irrational overconfidence and hubris.
Absolutely. Past success breeds arrogance. Leaders overvalue their strategic skill and foresight, and it leads to spectacular failures.
Like the Arab states leading up to the Six-Day War in 1967.
They profoundly misjudged Israel's military capability due to a toxic mixture of hubris and outdated intelligence.
And the source notes that this is especially pronounced among great powers. The U.S. intervention in Vietnam is the classic case.
American policymakers had the clear historical warning of France's defeat right there in front of them, yet they dismissed it completely.
Why?
They operated under the arrogant assumption that they were superior strategists, that they possessed unlimited military power that could somehow solve the fundamental political problem of supporting a corrupt, illegitimate South Vietnamese regime.
They failed to realize that military might cannot substitute for political support and local legitimacy.
And that exact pattern of hubris was repeated in Iraq in 2003, where U.S. planners assumed they would be greeted as liberators and failed to make any serious plans for reconstruction or governance.
And these calculated risks, often driven by status, by thumos and hubris, frequently lead initiators into sophisticated traps laid by weaker adversaries. This is the concept of the ethical trap.
Right. An ethical trap is a deliberate strategy by the weaker party. They use force or provocation in a way that forces the stronger adversary to retaliate massively.
Creating a political situation where the stronger party, even if they're responding to an initial aggression, loses the moral high ground and cedes third-party support.
Exactly.
The historical example a study uses to illustrate the initial recognition of this concept is fascinating: the Boston Tea Party.
It's a perfect illustration of strategic provocation. Radical Americans realized that previous unauthorized protests, like the Boston Massacre, had generated massive public sympathy because of the British overreaction.
So they learned from that.
They learned that if they could intentionally provoke a heavy-handed, unauthorized response from the British Crown, they could mobilize domestic and international support for their revolutionary cause. The Tea Party was successful primarily because of the punitive, disproportionate British response that followed.
Bring that strategy to the modern era, and the source points to the Gaza conflict, arguing that Hamas actively operates within the framework of setting an ethical trap.
Hamas initiates acts of violence, knowing full well that Israel's retaliation, driven by its military doctrine and security needs, will be massive and cause extensive civilian destruction.
And this immense response, in turn, is broadcast globally.
And it successfully generates domestic and international support for the Palestinian cause. The strategy often achieves critical political goals like undermining the legitimacy of the less radical Palestinian Authority or isolating Israel diplomatically, even at massive cost to the Palestinian population and to Hamas's own military resources.
So the primary goal is political and moral leverage.
That's the argument. It's cynical, but effective.
But the study also offers an example of an ethical trap avoided. India after the Mumbai attacks in 2008.
Right. Following the devastating terrorist attacks launched by Lashkar-e-Taiba, there was immense public and political pressure within India, especially from nationalist factions demanding immediate military retaliation against Pakistan.
The political incentive to strike back, fueled by thumos, that desire for revenge and status, must have been huge.
It was huge. However, India's government ultimately decided against military action.
What drove that restraint?
It was largely based on a cold, practical assessment of the potential consequences. They recognized that the available military options were unappealing, risky, and guaranteed to lead to diplomatic and military escalation with a nuclear-armed neighbor.
So by exercising restraint, India avoided a potential military disaster and the diplomatic fallout.
It showed that prioritizing practical outcomes over the emotional demand for immediate revenge is the key to escaping these traps.
Which brings us back, inevitably, to the great powers themselves. If they are the most frequent initiators and the most prone to hubris, they are the central problem.
We have to focus on the aggressive elites that run the US, Russia, France, the UK, and China. These 5 states insist on special privileges and the right to order the international system.
A right rooted in a historical self-understanding dating back to the Congress of Vienna.
Pretty much.
And we established the raw numbers. The U.S. with 13 initiations, Russia USSR with 9. This aggressive behavior is driven by the desire to maintain status, by thumos, even when economic logic dictates otherwise.
Historically, great power status was inextricably linked to territorial conquest and colonial possession. Now, international norms, like the UN Charter, have delegitimized territorial acquisition.
Making physical conquest politically impossible today.
Right. But these 5 powers continue to see limited intervention as a right, sometimes even a duty, to uphold their status and spheres of influence. They substitute intervention for outright conquest.
It's an updated form of historical entitlement. But the most damning evidence the study presents is the abysmal success rate of these interventions.
This is the core paradox of power. For all initiators in the dataset, the use of force is consistently risky and costly. The military success rate is only 33%.
So they only achieve their immediate military objectives in just 29 out of 88 cases.
Right, so even winning the battle is a toss-up.
But the political success rate, that's the real measure of failure.
It is a mere 21% success rate overall. 18 cases. Initiators globally lose the peace 4 times out of 5.
4 out of 5, wow.
And here's the most critical finding for our listener. The political success rate of the world's single most powerful state, the United States, is even lower.
Even lower. Can you break down the U.S. track record?
The U.S. was politically successful in only 4 of its 13 interventions and wars.
4 out of 13.
That's a political success rate hovering around 30% for its military missions, exceptionally low given the magnitude of American power.
And why do the great powers fail so frequently?
Because, as the study concludes, military action cannot solve fundamental political problems, especially those rooted in legitimacy, identity, or historical grievance.
Like the failure in Vietnam, where firepower couldn't legitimize a corrupt Saigon regime.
Or the long-term failure in Iraq.
In Iraq, 2003, the U.S. and UK achieved rapid military victory. But the failure to consolidate power, The subsequent political vacuum and the eventual sectarian fragmentation transformed the entire region.
In ways diametrically opposed to the initial strategic goals. They created disorder where they intended to install stability.
That raises the central critique of American hegemony that the source presents.
Mhm.
The U.S. constantly insists it must intervene to preserve a rules-based order and that its dominance facilitates global public goods.
And the authors argue that this perspective is, in large part, a delusion suffered by the national security establishment.
A delusion.
Well, while U.S. hegemony has provided stability in certain areas, the reality is that its repeated low-success uses of force are actually a serious source of disorder and instability internationally. Its claim to special privileges, the right to intervene unilaterally, is increasingly unacceptable to the majority of states,
Creating deep resentment and resistance.
which feeds right back into the cycle of thumos and provocation.
This analysis grounds itself in the extremely pessimistic current environment laid out by the author in 2025. It sounds like the risks are escalating both globally and internally to the established system.
The authors warn that the U.S. national security apparatus frequently suffers from analytical blindness, tautologically confirming the success of deterrence, for instance, even when crises erupt.
And now, in 2025, the risk is structural damage.
Yes. With a U.S. administration that rejects multilateralism and threatens to destroy long-standing treaty commitments, the traditional framework of the post-war order is under threat.
The scenario described is a potential replacement of the Western order with a tacit triumvirate of the U.S., Russia, and China.
A system based on spheres of influence, where each great power essentially agrees to allow the others to do as they wish in their respective near abroad.
That sounds like a regression.
A dangerous regression to the late 19th century. The authors warn that such a system would be inherently unstable, as the self-appointed hegemons would inevitably clash over the margins of their spheres.
So, if the great powers are the problem, where does that leave us?
Well, this deep dive tells us that the simple narrative of rational states pursuing security is insufficient. The persistence of conflict, despite the overall decline in war frequency, is rooted in a toxic mix of structural conditions
Like the lingering resentment of rump states.
and deeply ingrained non-material human motives, primarily the quest for status and revenge, or thumos.
And when you combine that thumos and misplaced fear with the hubris of great powers who believe their military might can substitute for political legitimacy.
You get that remarkably consistent 75% rate of miscalculation and failure. Leaders take excessive risks, bypassing rational assessment, driven by the desire to avoid perceived loss or to achieve status gains.
But this study does offer a powerful historical argument for hope. It's based on the capacity for collective learning, broken into three discernible waves.
Right. The first wave being economic learning.
Yes, the realization that wealth is overwhelmingly gained through production, innovation, and trade, which effectively ended wars of material aggrandizement.
The second wave was institutional learning. The realization, post-World War II, that collective security and institutional structures like the UN and NATO are the best path to stability.
And the third, slowest but perhaps most crucial wave of learning is the shift away from conquest and military dominance as the primary means of gaining status.
And the source points to post-World War II Germany as the ultimate success story here. Germany achieved enormous respect, influence, and political stability, eventually becoming the dominant political and economic force in Europe. How?
By systematically renouncing irredentist claims, accepting its post-war borders, and embracing multilateralism and democratic norms.
It shows influence through restraint and service, not through force.
That's a stark contrast to Russia, which has chosen the path of a rump state, seeking greatness through aggressive territorial restoration.
It is. And the ground for pessimism remains where this learning hasn't taken root, in regions with weak states, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, which invite outside intervention, creating massive spillover conflicts.
And you have actors like Iran, who have learned the lesson of proxy wars.
Exactly. Using low-risk, deniable militias to engage adversaries, thereby avoiding the high cost and ethical traps of direct military confrontation.
The ultimate complexity here is that the likelihood of conflict increases disproportionately when multiple motives and types reinforce each other. The U.S. intervention in Iraq in 2003 was a textbook cocktail of hubris, miscalculation, and a flawed quest for hegemonic status.
And it resulted in a dramatic, self-inflicted decline in international respect. On the eve of that invasion, global positive views of the U.S. were high. The year after the invasion, that number plummeted drastically, even among close allies.
The attempt to assert power and lock in resolve led to destabilization and widespread negative views.
The military success was immediate, the political failure was systemic and long-lasting.
Which brings us to our final takeaway for you, the learner. Something to consider as you process this study's findings. If military action so consistently fails to achieve long-term political goals, especially for the world's most powerful countries, often compounding their strategic woes through miscalculation and hubris, how might the focus on status, thumos, and influence be better pursued?
And if the true path to greatness in the 21st century is demonstrated by states like post-war Germany, which gained massive respect and influence precisely by renouncing irredentist claims and military aggression, then what is the practical strategic value of restraint?
What cost do the most powerful states incur today for clinging to an outdated definition of greatness rooted in the use of armed force?
The study suggests that their greatest weakness might be their inability to learn the lessons of the third wave.
That is certainly a powerful thought to mull over. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Until next time.